The letter arrived in Paris on a cold December morning in 1812. It was written in a careful, almost clinical hand, the kind of handwriting that betrays a man trying very hard not to let his emotions show through the ink. The letter was a bulletin, the 29th in a series, and it began with a sentence that would echo across Europe like a thunderclap: "The health of His Majesty has never been better." But the rest of the letter told a different story entirely. 6 months earlier, the largest army ever assembled in the history of the Western world had crossed a river into Russia. Nearly 500,000 soldiers, French, Polish, German, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Swiss, Croatian, had marched east under the eagles of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had redrawn the map of Europe, not once but several times over. They had marched with the absolute confidence of men who had never lost a major campaign. They had marched expecting a quick, decisive war, a few battles, a treaty. Another chapter in the legend. They came back as ghosts. Of the roughly 685,000 men who entered Russia in 1812, fewer than 120,000 returned in any condition to fight. Some estimates put the French losses, dead, captured, deserted, or permanently disabled, at over 400,000. The Russian army and civilian population suffered catastrophically as well, with losses that historians still debate but which certainly ran into the hundreds of thousands. Moscow, one of the great cities of the world, burned to the ground, and Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had seemed genuinely invincible just 2 years before, began the long, irreversible slide toward his final defeat. This is the story of how the greatest military mind of his age walked into a trap he had partly built himself, and how a campaign that was supposed to take 6 weeks ended up taking 6 months, consuming an empire and changing the course of world history. To understand why Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, you have to go back to a frozen river in eastern Prussia in the winter of 1807. After the Battle of Friedland, another crushing French victory in a decade full of them, Napoleon met Tsar Alexander I of Russia on a specially constructed raft in the middle of the Niemen River. The symbolism was deliberate. Neither man would set foot on the other's territory. They would meet in the middle as equals. The two emperors talked for hours, and by all accounts they genuinely liked each other. Napoleon reportedly called Alexander charming, intelligent, and surprisingly well-read. Alexander, for his part, seemed genuinely dazzled by the Frenchman's energy and vision. What emerged from that raft was the Treaty of Tilsit, and it reshaped Europe almost as dramatically as any battle. Russia would recognize Napoleon's restructuring of the continent. In exchange, France and Russia would be allies, even friends. They would divide the world between them, more or less. And crucially, Russia would join Napoleon's Continental system, his great economic blockade designed to strangle Britain by cutting off its trade with the rest of Europe. For a few years it worked, or at least it appeared to work. Napoleon was at the absolute peak of his power between 1807 and 1810. He controlled, directly or through family members and loyal marshals, virtually all of continental Europe from Spain to the borders of Russia. He had divorced his first wife, Josephine, and married an Austrian Archduchess, Marie-Louise, producing an heir he called the King of Rome. He seemed to have won. The question was no longer whether Napoleon would dominate Europe, but for how long and on what terms. But beneath the surface, the alliance with Russia was rotting. The Continental system was the core of the problem. Napoleon's economic blockade against Britain was economically devastating to Russia. Russian nobles, whose wealth depended on exporting grain, timber, and raw materials to Britain, were watching their incomes collapse. By 1810, Alexander was under enormous pressure from his own aristocracy to abandon the blockade. And so, quietly at first, and then more openly, Russia began allowing neutral ships, many of which were actually British ships flying neutral flags, to trade in Russian ports. Napoleon saw this as a betrayal. From his perspective, the entire strategy against Britain depended on total European compliance. One leak in the dam and the whole structure fell apart. He began pressuring Alexander, sending increasingly stern diplomatic messages. Alexander, who had his own pride and his own domestic pressures, pushed back. There were other irritants. Napoleon had annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, a small German territory, which happened to belong to a close relative of Alexander's. The Tsar demanded compensation. Napoleon offered some vague promises and changed the subject. Alexander grew colder. Napoleon grew more suspicious. By 1811, both sides were already preparing for war. Napoleon began moving troops toward the Russian frontier. Alexander began pulling Russian forces back from their positions in Central Europe and consolidating them. Diplomatic channels remained open, but both men understood that the conversation was essentially over. In the spring of 1812, Napoleon made his decision. He would invade Russia, force a decisive battle within the first few weeks, destroy the Russian army, and dictate terms from Moscow. Alexander would have no choice but to capitulate. The whole campaign, in Napoleon's estimation, would be over before winter. This was not an unreasonable plan on paper. Napoleon had done exactly this, or something very like it, multiple times before. He had crushed Austria in 1805, Prussia in 1806, and Russia itself at Friedland in 1807. He understood war as a sequence of decisive engagements: find the enemy's main force, bring it to battle, destroy it, then negotiate from a position of overwhelming strength. Speed, concentration, and the moral shock of defeat were his weapons. What he did not fully account for was Russia. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. The crossing took 3 days. Contemporary accounts describe the scale as almost incomprehensible: a river of men, horses, cannon, and supply wagons that stretched as far as the eye could see in both directions. Napoleon himself, according to one account, watched from a hill and seemed genuinely moved by the sight. This was the largest army ever assembled under a single command in Western history. The Russian forces facing them were divided into 2 main armies. The First Army of the West, commanded by General Barclay de Tolly, a cautious, methodical general of Scottish-German origin, numbered roughly 120,000 men. The Second Army, under the fiery and aggressive Prince Bagration, had around 45,000. Together they were significantly outnumbered, and worse, they were separated from each other by a gap that Napoleon immediately tried to exploit. The plan was to drive between the 2 Russian armies, isolate them, and destroy them one by one. It was a classic Napoleonic maneuver, the kind he had executed brilliantly before. And it very nearly worked, except that the Russians kept retreating. This is where the campaign began to go wrong in ways that were not immediately obvious. Barclay de Tolly, whatever his other qualities, understood one thing with perfect clarity: he could not win a pitched battle against Napoleon in the opening weeks of the campaign. The French were too numerous, too experienced, and led by the greatest battlefield commander alive. The only rational strategy was to retreat, delay, and wait for circumstances to change. He pulled back, and pulled back, and pulled back again, and every time Napoleon lunged forward expecting to catch him, the Russians were gone. This drove Napoleon's commanders to distraction. They had expected a quick, decisive campaign. Instead, they were marching, endlessly marching, through the summer heat of the Russian plains, covering 20 and 30 miles a day, watching the horizon for an enemy that refused to stand and fight. The supply lines, which had been stretched thin from the beginning, grew longer and more fragile with every mile. Horses began to die. Men began to fall out from heat, exhaustion, and disease. And the land itself seemed to offer nothing. The Russians, as they retreated, burned their crops, destroyed their bridges, and drove off their livestock. The French foraging parties came back empty-handed. Napoleon had expected to feed his army off the land, as he had done in previous campaigns. But those campaigns had been fought in the fertile, densely populated regions of Central Europe, where a village was never more than a few miles away, and a requisitioned granary could feed a division for a week. Russia was different. The distances were enormous, the population sparse, and what the Russians had not destroyed, the summer heat had dried out. The Grande Armée began to starve even before it reached Smolensk. There is a figure here that deserves to stop you cold. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in mid-August, less than 2 months into the campaign, he had already lost roughly 100,000 men. Not to battle, to disease, starvation, heat, and desertion. He had not yet fought a major engagement, and he had already lost nearly a fifth of his army. Smolensk was the first real battle of the campaign, and it was a brutal, inconclusive affair. The French stormed the city's outer defenses on August 17th, but the Russians fought hard, then withdrew during the night, burning the city behind them. Napoleon entered Smolensk the next morning to find it largely in ruins. He had hoped to winter there, to pause and consolidate, but the destruction made that impossible. The army needed food, and there was none to be found in the smoldering wreckage. He pushed on toward Moscow. At this point, there was a crisis of command on the Russian side that would ultimately determine the outcome of the campaign, though not in the way anyone expected. Barclay de Tolly's strategy of retreat was militarily sound, but it was politically and psychologically untenable. Russian public opinion was outraged, the nobility and the army itself were furious. You did not simply hand Smolensk, an ancient Russian city, a place of deep religious significance, to the French without a fight and expect to keep your command. Alexander, under enormous pressure, made a change. On August 20th, he appointed Mikhail Kutuzov as commander-in-chief of all Russian forces. Kutuzov was 67 years old, enormously fat, and missing an eye. He had lost it to a Turkish musket ball decades earlier. He had fought the Turks, the Poles, and the French. He had been at Austerlitz in 1805, where Napoleon had inflicted one of the most humiliating defeats in Russian history, and he had never forgotten it. He was shrewd, patient, and deeply Russian in a way that Barclay de Tolly, for all his abilities, was not. The soldiers loved him. He was also fundamentally in agreement with Barclay's strategy. He knew he could not defeat Napoleon in the open field. But he understood something else. He could not be seen to simply retreat. The army needed to fight. Russia needed to fight. And so he chose a position, dug in, and prepared to give battle. The place he chose was a village called Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow, September 7, 1812. The sun rose over the Borodino field to reveal two enormous armies facing each other across a landscape of rolling hills, ravines, and small rivers. The French had approximately 130,000 men. The Russians had roughly 120,000. Both sides had hundreds of artillery pieces. It was going to be a battle on a scale that even veterans of this brutal era had rarely seen. Napoleon was unwell that morning. He had a severe cold, possibly something worse, and accounts from those who saw him describe a man who seemed sluggish, less sharp than usual. His orders were slower in coming. His responses to the reports of his marshals were delayed. This is not an excuse. The battle's outcome had many causes, but it is a fact, and historians have noted it. The battle began at 6 in the morning and lasted for most of the day. It was, by the standards of the Napoleonic Wars, extraordinarily bloody. The French attacked the Russian positions repeatedly, seizing them, losing them, seizing them again. The central redoubt, a massive earthwork fortification that the French called the Great Redoubt and the Russians called the Raevski Battery, changed hands multiple times in fighting that was described by survivors on both sides as the most intense they had ever experienced. Napoleon had, at several critical moments, the option to commit his Imperial Guard, the elite reserve force that he had used to deliver the decisive blow in battle after battle. His marshals begged him to send them in. Murat, the cavalry commander, rode up personally and urged him to release the guard. Napoleon refused. He was far from France, he said. He could not risk losing his last reserve in a foreign country. If the guard was destroyed and the battle somehow went wrong, there would be nothing left. It was a reasonable calculation. It was also arguably the moment the campaign was lost. By the end of the day, the Russians still held their main positions. They had suffered catastrophic losses, somewhere between 40,000 and 45,000 men killed or wounded. The French had lost perhaps 35,000. Both sides were exhausted. Kutuzov, surveying the wreckage of his army that evening, made the decision that would define his legacy. He ordered a retreat. He would not fight again for Moscow. He would save the army. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14, 1812. He rode to the Dorogomilov Gate and waited for a delegation of city officials to come out and present him with the keys to the city, as had happened in Vienna, in Berlin, in Warsaw, in Madrid. It was the ritual of conquest, the ceremony that marked the end of a campaign. No delegation came. The city was almost entirely empty. The governor of Moscow, a man named Rostopchin, had ordered the evacuation of virtually the entire population. Somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of a million people had simply left. The streets were silent, the shops were shuttered. The great city of Moscow, one of the wealthiest and most populous in Europe, had been abandoned. And then it started to burn. The fires began that same night. Whether they were set deliberately by Rostopchin's agents, by retreating Russian soldiers, by accident, or by some combination of all three is still debated by historians. What is not debated is the result. Within days, roughly 3/4 of Moscow was in flames. The wooden buildings, and most of Moscow's buildings were wooden, went up like kindling. Napoleon and his staff had to flee the Kremlin at one point. As the fire approached, moving through smoke-filled streets while the city burned around them. When the fires finally died down, Napoleon was left in possession of a ruin. There was little food, there was little shelter for his men, and there was no sign that Alexander intended to negotiate. This was the trap. Napoleon had expected that the fall of Moscow, the ancient capital, the spiritual heart of Russia, would force Alexander to the table. Every calculation he had made, every precedent from his previous campaigns, told him that a ruler whose capital had been taken would have no choice but to make peace. He sent Alexander 3 separate offers to negotiate. Alexander did not reply to any of them. The weeks passed. September became October. The nights grew cold. The first frosts came early that year. Napoleon's army sat in the ruins of Moscow, eating what little they could find, waiting for a response that never came. The men grew restless, then demoralized. Desertion increased. Discipline began to fray. Napoleon's generals urged him to leave. Every day they stayed in Moscow was another day the Russian army was recovering, reorganizing, and being reinforced. Every day they stayed was another day closer to the Russian winter, the legendary, murderous Russian winter that everyone in the army had heard about and none of them had experienced. Napoleon hesitated. Leaving Moscow without a peace treaty meant admitting, at least implicitly, that the campaign had failed. And Napoleon Bonaparte did not fail. He could not fail. His entire political legitimacy, the foundation of everything he had built, rested on the image of invincibility. To retreat from Moscow with nothing to show for it was not just a military setback, it was an existential threat to his authority. He waited 5 weeks. On October 19, 1812, the Grande Armée finally left Moscow. It numbered roughly 100,000 men, a force still formidable on paper, but already hollowed out by weeks of poor nutrition, disease, and the psychological damage of sitting in a burned city waiting for a peace that never came. They carried enormous amounts of loot, artwork, silver, furniture, icons stripped from churches, which would slow them down and ultimately be abandoned on the road. They also carried thousands of wounded men who had no business marching anywhere. Napoleon initially tried to take a different route back, a southern road through less devastated countryside, where his army might find food and fodder. Kutuzov blocked him at the Battle of Maloyaroslavets on October 24th. The fighting was fierce and inconclusive, but the strategic result was clear. Napoleon was forced back onto the Smolensk road, the same road his army had already stripped bare on the way in. The retreat had begun, and then the temperature dropped. The winter of 1812 came early and with extraordinary violence. By early November, temperatures had fallen to -15, -20, and eventually -30 degrees Celsius in some areas. The soldiers, many of whom had already lost or worn out their winter clothing during the long summer march, had almost nothing to protect them. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost fingers, toes, noses, ears. Those who fell behind, and many fell behind, were at the mercy of the Russian climate and the Russian peasants, who had seen their villages burned and their livestock taken and who showed little mercy in return. The Cossacks, the light cavalry of the Russian army, harassed the column relentlessly. They did not try to fight the French in pitched battle. They rode along the flanks, cutting off stragglers, attacking supply trains, picking off isolated groups. It was a kind of warfare that Napoleon's army, designed for decisive engagement, had no effective answer to. The road became a nightmare that defied description, though many survivors tried. One of them, a young sergeant named Bourgogne, kept a diary that has survived to the present day. He described roads littered with dead horses, abandoned cannon, wrecked wagons, and the bodies of men who had simply sat down in the snow and never gotten up again. He described soldiers burning their own equipment to stay warm, then dying anyway. He described officers and enlisted men, stripped of all rank distinctions by shared suffering, huddled together around fires that barely held back the cold. The army that had entered Russia as the finest military force in the world was dissolving into a frozen, starving mob. There were still moments of military coherence. Napoleon himself, for all his failures of judgment in the strategic planning of the campaign, showed genuine personal courage and organizational ability during the retreat. He worked to maintain order, to keep the army moving, to prevent the complete disintegration that threatened at every stage. His marshals, Ney, Davout, Murat, performed acts of extraordinary leadership under impossible conditions. Marshal Ney's rearguard action deserves particular mention. Michel Ney commanded the rear of the retreating column, the most dangerous position in any retreat. the men who had to hold off the pursuing Russians while the rest of the army moved forward. At one point, cut off from the main body and surrounded by Russian forces, Ney was reported to have been killed or captured. Napoleon, receiving the news, is said to have declared, "I have 300 million francs in my treasury. I would give them all to have Ney back." Ney was not dead. He led his men on an extraordinary 3-day march through the forests and across the frozen Dnieper River, evading Russian forces, and rejoined the main army with several thousand men still under his command. Napoleon embraced him personally. He gave him the title Prince of the Moskva and called him the bravest of the brave, but individual acts of heroism could not change the arithmetic of catastrophe. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November 1812 is one of the most dramatic episodes in military history and one of the most terrible. The Berezina was a significant river, normally fordable in places, but swollen by autumn rains and partially iced over in the early winter cold. Napoleon's engineers had to build 2 pontoon bridges under fire, in freezing water, with Russian forces pressing on both banks. The engineers, many of them Dutch and Polish, worked in the river for hours in temperatures well below freezing. Many of them died of hypothermia before the bridges were complete. They knew, and they built anyway. The crossing took 3 days. The bridges were narrow, and the mass of people trying to cross, soldiers, camp followers, civilians who had attached themselves to the army, wounded men on carts, created a crush that became lethal. At several points, the bridges partially collapsed under the weight. People fell into the freezing water, others were trampled. When the French rear guard finally crossed and burned the bridges behind them on November 29th, there were still thousands of people on the eastern bank, stragglers, the wounded who could not move, civilians who had not been able to push through the crowd in time. The Russian forces that arrived found a scene of devastation that shocked even men who had been fighting this campaign for months. The army that emerged from the Berezina crossing was perhaps 40,000 men, still capable of bearing arms, along with tens of thousands of non-combatants in various states of collapse. They still had hundreds of miles to march before they reached safety. Then the temperature dropped again. In early December, the thermometer fell to levels that contemporary accounts describe as almost incomprehensible, -37, -40 degrees Celsius in some reports. At these temperatures, metal becomes brittle. Horses die standing up. A man who falls asleep does not wake up. The army, already at the edge of survival, was pushed beyond it. The losses in those final weeks of the retreat were staggering. Entire regiments simply ceased to exist, not because they were destroyed in battle, but because the men lay down in the snow and froze. The road to Vilna and then to the Niemen River was lined with the dead. Napoleon himself left the army on December 5, 1812, handing command to Murat and racing back to Paris in a sleigh. He had received word that a general named Mallet had attempted a coup in Paris, exploiting the news of the army's destruction to claim that Napoleon was dead and try to seize power. The coup had failed. It was a poorly organized affair, but it had revealed something alarming. Napoleon's hold on France was not as absolute as he had believed. His presence was needed. He left his army dying in the snow and drove west. There is something almost surreal about the contrast. Napoleon, traveling in a heated sleigh through the winter landscape, crossing the same territory his army was dying in, stopping at post stations, eating hot meals, covering the distance in days that had taken his army months. He arrived in Paris on December 18th and immediately set about managing the political fallout, issuing reassuring bulletins, planning the next campaign. The 29th bulletin, the one that began with a statement about his excellent health, was his way of finally, partially, acknowledging the disaster. Between the lines of careful military language, the truth was visible. The Grande Armée had been destroyed. The remnants of the army crossed back over the Niemen River in mid-December. The campaign was over. Now we need to talk about why this happened, because the Russian campaign was not simply bad luck or the result of an unusually cold winter, though the winter was certainly unusually cold. It was the product of a series of decisions, assumptions, and structural problems that had been building for years. Napoleon's fundamental error was strategic. He assumed that Russia would behave like the states he had defeated before, that the capture of Moscow would produce the same psychological and political shock as the capture of Vienna or Berlin. He did not understand, or did not sufficiently account for, the difference between a centralized Western European state and the vast, decentralized reality of the Russian Empire. Alexander could lose Moscow and still have Russia. A Prussian or Austrian king in the same position would have had no choice but to negotiate. The logistics were a catastrophe waiting to happen. Napoleon's army was simply too large to feed off the land in Russia, and the supply system he had organized was inadequate for the distances involved. This was not entirely his fault. The distances were genuinely unprecedented in European warfare, but he was warned, and he proceeded anyway. By the time the army reached Smolensk, it had already lost a fifth of its strength without fighting a major battle. That is a logistical failure of the first order. The decision to wait in Moscow was almost certainly the decisive error of the campaign. Every week he waited was a week the Russian army recovered and the weather worsened. His marshals knew it, his closest advisors knew it. Napoleon, unable to accept the implications of retreat, waited anyway. There is also the question of what the campaign revealed about the limits of Napoleon's style of warfare. His genius was for the decisive battle, the concentrated, overwhelming blow that shattered an enemy's army and will to resist in a single day. Against an enemy who refused to be shattered, who retreated endlessly and traded space for time, his genius had no purchase. Russia was too large, the distances too vast, the enemy too willing to absorb punishment. Kutuzov understood this. His strategy, which was derided at the time and celebrated afterward, was simply to not lose, to preserve the Russian army, to let the French destroy themselves, to wait for the winter and the distances and the supply problems to do the work that Russian bayonets could not safely do alone. It was not a glamorous strategy, it was a winning one. The consequences of the Russian campaign unfolded over the next 2 years with the remorseless logic of a collapsing structure. In the immediate term, the destruction of the Grande Armée shattered the myth of Napoleonic invincibility. Prussia, which had been a reluctant French ally, switched sides in February 1813 and signed an alliance with Russia. Austria, which had been watching carefully, joined the coalition against France in August. Sweden, under the command of one of Napoleon's own former marshals, Bernadotte, was already in the coalition. Britain, which had never stopped fighting, poured money and resources into the Allied cause. Napoleon, with extraordinary energy and organizational ability, raised a new army in 1813. He won several battles. He was still Napoleon, and there were moments when it seemed possible he might stabilize the situation. But the new army was inexperienced, short of horses, the cavalry losses in Russia had been catastrophic and could not be quickly replaced, and facing a coalition that had finally learned, after a decade of defeats, how to coordinate against him. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the so-called Battle of the Nations, the largest battle in European history up to that point, Napoleon was defeated by a coalition of Russian, Prussian, Austrian and Swedish forces. He retreated to France. The Allied armies crossed the Rhine. Paris fell in March 1814. Napoleon abdicated on April 6, 1814. He was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. He came back, of course, the 100 Days, the return from Elba, the final campaign that ended at Waterloo in June 1815. But that is a different story. The point is that the Russian campaign was the hinge on which everything turned. Before Russia, Napoleon was the master of Europe. After Russia, he was a man fighting a losing war against a coalition that would not stop until he was gone. The long-term consequences reached far beyond Napoleon himself. The campaign accelerated and intensified Russian nationalism in ways that would shape the country for generations. The burning of Moscow, which Russians experienced as a national trauma and a national triumph simultaneously, became central to Russian identity. Kutuzov became a hero of almost mythological proportions. The War of 1812 entered Russian culture as the defining moment of national resistance, celebrated in literature, music, and art. Tolstoy's War and Peace, published half a century later, is in many ways the ultimate expression of this national myth, a vast, sprawling meditation on what the campaign meant, who the real heroes were, and what it revealed about the nature of historical causation. The campaign also contributed to the eventual weakening of the Napoleonic system in ways that played out across Europe over the following decades. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815, which reorganized Europe after Napoleon's defeat, was shaped in part by the lessons of the Russian campaign, particularly the danger of allowing any single power to dominate the continent. The balance of power system that emerged from Vienna would shape European diplomacy for a century. There is another legacy that is less often discussed, but perhaps equally significant: the campaign's impact on military thinking. Napoleon's defeat in Russia demonstrated, for the first time in the modern era, the limits of the strategy of decisive battle against an enemy with sufficient strategic depth to absorb losses and trade space for time. This lesson was not always learned. Military planners in later centuries would make similar mistakes in similar spaces, but it was there for anyone willing to study it. The human cost deserves a moment of direct attention. The numbers are so large that they can become abstract, which is a kind of injustice to the people behind them. Somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 soldiers died in the Russian campaign of 1812. French, Russian, and the dozens of other nationalities caught up in Napoleon's wars. Civilian deaths, from the burning of Moscow, from the destruction of the countryside, from the disease and disruption that followed armies through the land, added hundreds of thousands more. These were real people, farmers and students, fathers and sons, men who had been dragged into a war between emperors and paid for it with their lives in the snow of a country most of them had never seen before. The Sergeant Bourgogne, whose diary we mentioned earlier, survived. He went on to fight in the campaigns of 1813 and 1814. He was at Waterloo, he lived to old age, and he spent decades writing and rewriting his account of the retreat, trying to find words adequate to what he had seen. He never quite succeeded, he said. Some things were beyond language. Napoleon himself survived the campaign, survived Elba, survived the 100 Days, and ended his life on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, dictating his memoirs to a small group of loyal companions. In those memoirs, he offered his own interpretation of the Russian campaign, one that emphasized the unusual severity of the winter, the treachery of allies, the failures of subordinates. He was not entirely wrong about any of these things, but he was also not entirely honest. He knew at some level that the fundamental error had been his own. The decision to invade, the decision to wait in Moscow, the assumption that Russia would behave like every other country he had conquered. He had built his career on reading situations with extraordinary clarity and acting with extraordinary speed. In Russia, he had misread the situation, and he had moved too slowly. The greatest general of his age had been defeated not by a better general, but by distance winter, and the stubbornness of a people who simply refused to do what he needed them to do. There is a moment, recorded by one of his companions on St. Helena, that has stayed with historians. Napoleon was discussing the campaign one evening, going through the decisions, the turning points, the alternatives. He was lucid, analytical, almost detached, the commander reviewing a battle long after the fact. And then he stopped, and he said something that was not analytical at all. It was the greatest madness, he said, and I knew it. Even then, I knew it. Whether he actually said this, whether the companion's memory was accurate, whether Napoleon was being honest or performing a kind of retrospective wisdom, these are questions we cannot answer with certainty. The moment may be apocryphal, but it captures something true about the campaign. That even at the time, even to those who planned it, the Russian adventure had an air of recklessness about it. The scale was too vast, the assumptions too optimistic, the margin for error too thin. Napoleon had bet everything on a strategy that required his enemy to cooperate with his own defeat, and Russia refused. The Niemen River, which the Grande Armée had crossed with such confidence in June 1812, was crossed again in December, this time by the frozen, starving remnants of what had been the most powerful military force in the world. The soldiers who made that final crossing were not the same men who had marched east 6 months before. They had seen things that changed people permanently. They had survived things that most of their comrades had not. Some of them, in later years, would try to explain what had happened. They would talk about the heat of the summer march, the endless retreating Russians, the burning of Moscow, the cold that came down like a wall in November. They would talk about the dead horses, the abandoned cannon, the men sitting in the snow. They would talk about the Berezina and the bridges and the sound of the ice breaking, and they would talk, almost always, about the silence. The silence of the Russian plain in winter, stretching in every direction, indifferent and absolute, a silence that swallowed armies whole and left no trace. Napoleon's invasion of Russia was not the end of his story, but it was the beginning of the end. It broke something, in the army, in France, in the myth of Napoleonic invincibility that had sustained the empire for a decade. The cracks that appeared in 1812 widened in 1813, and by 1814 the whole structure had collapsed. The world that emerged from Napoleon's defeat was different from the world that had existed before him, partly because of what he had built, partly because of what he had destroyed, and partly because of what his defeat had demonstrated. The idea that a single man, however brilliant, however energetic, however ruthless, could impose his will on the whole of Europe had been tested against the reality of Russia and found wanting. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The Russian plain has a way of reminding the world at intervals of certain permanent facts about distance, winter, and the limits of military ambition. The lesson has had to be relearned more than once. Napoleon learned it too late, in the snow of a country that would not be conquered, at the cost of 500,000 lives and the beginning of the end of his empire. The eagles came home without their army, and Europe began slowly, painfully to change. If this story of ambition, catastrophe, and consequence resonated with you, there is much more to explore. The aftermath of Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna, the reshaping of Europe, the long shadow that the Napoleonic era cast over the 19th century is a story just as rich and just as consequential. And if you want to understand how Napoleon rose to the point where an invasion of Russia even seemed possible, the story of his earlier campaigns, from Italy in 1796 to Austerlitz in 1805, is one of the most extraordinary sequences of military achievement in recorded history. If you found this video worth your time, leaving a comment about which aspect of the campaign struck you most, the strategic failures, the human cost, the question of what Napoleon should have done differently, genuinely helps this channel reach people who would find this kind of history valuable. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the kind of content you can expect here. History told with the seriousness and the drama it deserves, without shortcuts, without simplifications, and without forgetting that behind every date and every battle, there were real human beings making decisions whose consequences they could not fully foresee. The next video is waiting. History does not stop. But before we close the book entirely on 1812, there are threads we have not yet fully pulled. Threads that, when examined closely, reveal even more about why this campaign matters beyond the battlefield, beyond the body counts, beyond the rise and fall of one extraordinary man. Let us talk about the soldiers themselves, not the marshals, not the emperors, not the generals on horseback surveying the carnage from a safe distance. The ordinary men who marched into Russia in the summer heat and stumbled back out in the winter cold. The Grande Armée of 1812 was, in a very real sense, a European army rather than a French one. Of the roughly 685,000 men who crossed the Niemen, fewer than half were actually French. The rest were Poles, who fought with particular ferocity, animated by the hope that Napoleon would restore a Polish state, Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine, Italians from the Kingdom of Italy, Dutch, Swiss, Spanish, Croats, and a dozen other nationalities besides. Many of them did not speak French. Many of them had little personal loyalty to Napoleon, and were fighting because their rulers had been absorbed into his system and had no choice but to supply troops. This matters because it tells us something important about the nature of the Napoleonic Empire. It was not, despite the mythology that grew up around it, a purely French enterprise. It was a coalition held together partly by military success, partly by fear, and partly by the genuine ideological appeal of the Napoleonic system, the civil code, the abolition of feudal privileges, the promise of rational administration. When the Russian campaign destroyed the myth of military invincibility, the coalition began to unravel almost immediately. The German states that had marched east with Napoleon were the first to switch sides in 1813. They had never been enthusiastic allies, and the disaster in Russia gave them both the reason and the opportunity to leave. The Polish soldiers are a particularly poignant case. The Poles had more invested in Napoleon's success than almost anyone else in his coalition. He had created the Duchy of Warsaw from Prussian and Austrian-held Polish territories, and many Poles genuinely believed that a French victory would eventually lead to the restoration of an independent Poland. They fought accordingly. The Polish cavalry, in particular, had a reputation for reckless courage that was acknowledged even by their enemies. At the Berezina crossing, Polish lancers played a critical role in holding the bridgeheads against Russian attacks, suffering enormous casualties. Napoleon never delivered on the implicit promise to Poland. He used Polish hopes as a tool of policy and never committed to their fulfillment. After his defeat, Poland was divided again at the Congress of Vienna, and the dream of independence would have to wait another century. The Poles who died in the Russian snow had fought for a cause that their patron was never fully prepared to champion. There is a particular kind of historical tragedy in that, men dying for a promise that was never quite made, in service of a vision that was never quite sincere. Now consider the Russian side of the equation, because the Russian experience of 1812 is as complex and as important as the French one, and it is often reduced in Western accounts to a supporting role in Napoleon's story. For Russia, the War of 1812 was not simply a military campaign. It became, almost immediately, something closer to a religious and national experience. When Moscow burned, and the burning of Moscow shocked the world, including many Russians who had not expected Rostopchin to go through with it, it created a kind of collective trauma that paradoxically strengthened Russian resolve. You do not burn your own holy city unless you are prepared to fight to the last. The burning was a statement. We will destroy everything before we let you have it. Alexander I, who had seemed wavering and uncertain in the early stages of the campaign, found in the crisis a moral clarity he had previously lacked. He made a public declaration that he would not make peace as long as a single French soldier remained on Russian soil. He meant it. His refusal to respond to Napoleon's 3 offers of negotiation from Moscow was not stubbornness or diplomatic miscalculation. It was a deliberate strategy, and it worked. The Russian Orthodox Church played a significant role in framing the war as a sacred struggle. Napoleon was portrayed in Russian religious propaganda as the Antichrist, a charge that was not entirely without foundation in the apocalyptic imagination of early 19th century Russia, given that he had reorganized the Catholic Church in France, suppressed monasteries across Europe, and shown a casual indifference to religious sensibilities that many Russians found genuinely diabolical. The framing of the war as a holy defense of the motherland, and the faith gave ordinary Russian soldiers and civilians a framework for understanding their suffering and their sacrifice that was enormously powerful. The peasants of Russia deserve particular mention. In the territories through which both armies passed, the peasantry experienced the war as a catastrophe that came from both directions. The French army stripped the land of everything it could carry, and the Russian army in its retreat destroyed what remained. Entire villages were burned, crops were ruined, livestock was taken. The suffering of the Russian countryside in 1812 was immense and is often underrepresented in histories that focus on the armies and their movements. But the peasants also fought back. Partisan warfare, the kind of irregular, decentralized resistance that Napoleon's conventional army had no effective doctrine for, became a significant factor in the campaign, particularly during the retreat. Armed peasant bands attacked French foraging parties, cut off stragglers, and provided intelligence to the Russian army. One of the most celebrated partisan leaders was a hussar officer named Denis Davidov, who operated with a small force of cavalry and armed peasants behind French lines throughout the autumn of 1812. He was romanticized in his own lifetime and became one of the inspirations for Tolstoy's character Denisov in War and Peace. The partisan war was not decisive in itself, but it contributed to the cumulative attrition that destroyed the Grande Armée. Every foraging party that did not return was food that did not reach the soldiers. Every courier that was intercepted was information that did not reach Napoleon. Every small ambush added to the psychological pressure on men who were already at the edge of endurance. There is also a dimension of the campaign that is rarely discussed in popular accounts, but which historians have increasingly recognized as significant: the role of disease. Modern epidemiological research, including studies of mass graves from the campaign discovered in Vilna in the early 2000s, has confirmed what contemporary accounts suggested, that epidemic disease, particularly typhus, was a major killer throughout the campaign. Typhus, spread by lice in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of military camps, was already ravaging the army before it crossed the Niemen. By the time the army reached Smolensk, hospitals were overwhelmed. The sick and the dying were often simply left behind as the army moved on, unable to carry men who could not walk. This is one of the most important and least romantic facts about warfare in this era. Disease killed more soldiers than battle in virtually every major campaign of the Napoleonic Wars. In Russia, with its vast distances, its disrupted supply lines, and its extremes of heat and cold, the conditions for epidemic disease were almost perfect. The army that Napoleon led into Russia was already being eaten from within before the first shot was fired. The discovery of those mass graves in Vilna, containing the remains of thousands of soldiers from a dozen different nations, gave physical form to what the historical records had always described. Archaeologists found men buried with their personal effects: buttons, buckles, coins, the occasional letter. They found evidence of the diseases that had killed them. They found, in the careful arrangement of the bones, evidence that someone had tried to bury them with some dignity, even at the worst moments of the retreat. It is a reminder that history is not only about the decisions of emperors and the movements of armies. It is also about the men who carried the muskets and the women who followed the camps and the children who watched the armies pass through their villages. The Russian campaign of 1812 was a catastrophe on a scale that touched virtually every family in France and in the other nations of Napoleon's empire. There was almost no one in the French-controlled territories of Europe who did not lose a father, a brother, a son, or a neighbor in Russia. The political consequences within France itself are worth examining more carefully than they usually receive. Napoleon's management of the news from Russia was a masterpiece of information control for a while. The bulletins he issued were carefully worded to minimize the scale of the disaster. And in the early stages of the campaign, when the army was advancing and there were no major defeats to report, the French public was largely kept in the dark about the logistical crisis unfolding in the east. But as the autumn wore on and the letters stopped arriving from soldiers who had been killed or captured, and as the survivors of the early stages of the retreat began trickling back into France with their frostbitten faces and their hollow eyes, the truth became impossible to suppress entirely. The 29th bulletin, released in December, was Napoleon's acknowledgement that something had gone badly wrong. He blamed the weather. Specifically, he blamed an early and unusually severe winter that had caught the army unprepared. This was partly true. The winter of 1812 was genuinely exceptional, but it was also a deflection from the deeper failures of planning and judgment that had made the campaign vulnerable to exactly the kind of catastrophe that occurred. French public opinion, which had been largely supportive of Napoleon through a decade of wars, began to shift after Russia. The losses were too great, the failure too visible, the gap between the official narrative and the visible reality too wide. The mothers and wives of France had been absorbing the cost of Napoleon's ambitions for years, and Russia finally pushed many of them past the point of acceptance. This did not immediately translate into political opposition. Napoleon's police state was efficient at suppressing dissent, but it created a reservoir of exhaustion and grief that would matter when the final crisis came in 1814. The broader European context of the campaign's aftermath deserves one more careful look. The years between 1813 and 1815 saw a fundamental transformation in the nature of the coalition against Napoleon. Previous coalitions had been fragile, poorly coordinated, and prone to collapse after a single major French victory. The coalition that formed after Russia was different. It had learned from experience. The Allied commanders, particularly the Prussian Blücher and the Austrian Schwarzenberg, had developed a strategy specifically designed to avoid the kind of decisive engagement at which Napoleon excelled. They would attack his subordinates, avoid his main force, and concentrate only when they had overwhelming numerical superiority. This strategy, sometimes called the Trachenberg Plan after the Silesian castle where it was developed in the summer of 1813, was essentially an acknowledgement of Kutuzov's insight applied on a continental scale. You could not beat Napoleon by fighting him on his own terms. You had to change the terms. It worked. Napoleon won individual battles in 1813, at Lutzen, at Bautzen, at Dresden, but he could not convert tactical victories into strategic success because the coalition refused to break. Every time he defeated one Allied army, the others regrouped and came back. The attrition was relentless, and France bled white by 2 decades of war, and the catastrophe of Russia could not keep pace. Leipzig in October 1813 was the culmination of this strategy, 3 Allied armies converging on Napoleon simultaneously, engaging him from multiple directions, preventing the concentration that was the foundation of his tactical genius. He fought brilliantly for 3 days and lost anyway. The retreat from Leipzig turned into another catastrophe when the bridge over the Elster River was blown prematurely, trapping thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side of the river. The parallels with the Berezina were not lost on those who had survived both. Napoleon's final campaign in France in early 1814 is, in many ways, his most technically impressive. Outnumbered and out-resourced, fighting on his own soil with a fraction of the forces he had commanded at his peak, he won a series of rapid victories against Allied detachments that reminded observers of his early Italian campaigns. For a few weeks in February 1814, it seemed possible, barely possible, that he might somehow stabilize the situation. But the Allied commanders had learned their lesson too well. They kept moving, kept the pressure on, refused to be deterred by local defeats. Paris fell on March 30th. Napoleon's marshals, exhausted and unwilling to fight on, refused to continue. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. The road from the Niemen to Fontainebleau, From that confident crossing in June 1812 to the abdication document signed in the palace where French kings had hunted for centuries took less than 2 years. In historical terms, it was extraordinarily swift. An empire that had seemed permanent, that had restructured an entire continent, that had lasted a decade and a half and consumed the lives of millions, collapsed within 24 months of the Russian disaster. This is perhaps the most important single lesson of the campaign, that military empires built on the myth of invincibility are structurally fragile in a way that is not visible until the myth breaks. Napoleon's empire did not fall because France was weak or because his enemies were strong. It fell because the system depended on the perception of inevitable French victory. And once that perception was shattered, once the world saw that the Grande Armée could be destroyed, that Napoleon could be beaten, that the eagles could be driven back, the entire structure began to come apart. The Russian campaign of 1812 shattered that perception beyond repair. Everything that followed was consequence. We began this story with a letter, the 29th bulletin, arriving in Paris on a cold December morning, announcing with careful understatement that the greatest military disaster in modern European history had just occurred. It is fitting to end with a letter as well. Among the documents that have survived from the campaign is a letter written by a French officer named Captain François, addressed to his wife in Lyon. It was written in late November 1812, somewhere on the road between Smolensk and the Berezina. It was found on his body after the crossing. His wife received it months later, delivered by a survivor who had promised to carry it. The letter is not dramatic. It does not describe battles or strategic failures or the decisions of emperors. It describes the cold. It describes the hunger. It describes the men around him, many of whom he had known for years, who were dying one by one. And it ends with a sentence that has no military significance whatsoever, but which contains perhaps more truth about the campaign than any strategic analysis. He wrote, "I do not understand how we came to be here. I only know that I want very much to come home." He did not come home, but the words did. And they remind us, as all the best history ultimately reminds us, that behind the grand sweep of empires and the clash of armies, there are always individual human beings who did not choose the circumstances of their lives, who were caught up in forces larger than themselves, and who wanted, in the end, nothing more extraordinary than to return to the people they loved. Napoleon's invasion of Russia was a turning point in world history. It was also, at its most fundamental level, a human catastrophe, a story of ambition overreaching itself, of planning colliding with reality, of the vast indifference of geography and climate to the plans of even the most brilliant minds. It changed Europe. It changed warfare. It changed the way the world thought about power and its limits. And it sent hundreds of thousands of men into the snow, most of whom never came back. That is worth remembering. That is worth understanding. And that is why history, told honestly and carefully, still matters. If this story moved you or taught you something new, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next chapter. There is so much more to explore: the Congress of Vienna and the world that rose from Napoleon's ashes, the 100 Days and the final act at Waterloo, or if you want to go further back, the story of how a young artillery officer from Corsica became the master of Europe in the first place. Every one of those stories connects to this one. Because history is not a series of isolated events. It is a single continuous thread, and every thread leads somewhere. Leave a comment below telling me which part of the 1812 campaign you found most striking. Was it the strategic miscalculations, the human cost of the retreat, the burning of Moscow, or something else entirely? I read every comment, and your responses genuinely shape what this channel covers next. The story continues. It always does.